really interested to hear about the process of writing a novel and how that's very much through the written word. It definitely conjures up images, but then when you see that in a film and see adaptations purely visually of your work, what is that like?
Well, the process is usually long, and that slowness takes away any sense of wonder. That doesn't make it any less fascinating, but I'm often asked, it must be amazing to see your stuff on the screen. It's a relief finally to get there. That doesn't make it any less fascinating, but I'm often asked, it must be amazing to see your stuff on the screen. It's a relief finally to get there. Most movies don't happen, usually because they fail at the level of finance. And it's got harder and harder these recent years. What used to be a sort of ground level for an art movie would be $15 million. Now it's $5 million. And it's quite hard to raise $5 million. Novels are, as you say, a very visual form. I try to see scenes as I write, and that's why I don't find the process of adaptation quite such a leap as people might think. We are visual creatures. For me, getting to the emotional heart of any scene is really to get the readers to see it. To imagine the scene in such a way and describe the scene in such a way that I can hold a reasonable hope that the reader is seeing it the way I do. With the screenplay, well, a screenplay is not a finished art form. It's really like a recipe, and it stands in that relationship as a recipe does to a finished meal. And many, many hands are going to intervene, and things never work out as you imagine them, ever. And they often work out better. Sometimes watching rushes in the evenings, your breath's taken away because you never thought to do it this way. You never saw it that way. And in fact, coming back to the element of surprise, it's the rushes. After a long post-production, nothing seems quite surprising. You've seen it so many times. But the first time, watching 6 takes of something, usually through encoding, beamed through into your own study, that is a delightful moment of transition.
And then talking about screenplay, obviously On Chesil Beach, which is previewing tonight, you wrote the screenplay yourself. Because obviously you've done novels, short stories, and some plays as well. Has writing a screenplay always been something that you wanted to do?
Actually, I wrote my first screenplay in 1974, right at the beginning of my career, and I've more or less stayed with it, with some long breaks in the 90s. But I wrote for television in the 70s. Then I wrote a TV movie which was directed by my friend Richard Eyre. That was called The Imitation Game. There's no copyright on titles. Then we made a movie called The Ploughman's Lunch, a sort of state of the nation political movie in the early 80s. And I've worked with Mike Newell, made a movie with a Chinese cast called Sour Sweet. I wrote a Hollywood movie, which was actually quite successful, called The Good Son, with Macaulay Culkin. So this has run in parallel to my novel writing career. But I'm fairly impatient. There are many screenwriters who are very content to just write screenplays, and if they don't get made, move on to another one. If mine don't get made, I go into a sulk, really. And I had 2 in a row that didn't get made in the 90s, and I thought, that's it. I could have written 2 novels in the time I've been doing this. And by the way, right at the beginning, I worked with Bertolucci for 2 years on a Moravia novel. And at the end of that, Bernardo went off to make The Last Emperor in China, and I went back to novels. But it was a great educational experience for me to work with such a master. Why did I come back to it? Well, the material itself on Chesil Beach is so delicate and tender and intimate that I didn't really want anyone else messing around with it. And I certainly didn't want someone to make it pornographic or over-sexualized or exploitative. And I was very, very keen to hold it to myself. Those are rather negative reasons, I suppose. I didn't want anyone else to do it. But actually, once I was involved in writing, I got completely absorbed at the technical level. There's no dialogue, or not very much dialogue, in the first half of the novel. Not till the characters get on the beach and have their row do we really get the full flow of dialogue. So inventing dialogue for them was really like reinventing the characters. There are also some scenes I wrote for the movie that, had I thought of them when I was writing the novel, I would have put them in the novel. So it was a great opportunity to have second thoughts. There were certain things that were just irresistible for movies that were not irresistible for a novel. Towards the end of the movie, for example, I wanted the young man, now an old man, to go to Wigmore Hall and hear the girl he once loved, and still loves perhaps, play her last concert. And she's also now in her late 60s, and she sees him in the audience, and they each shed a tear. Now that is not in the novel, but it's irresistible. And I also wrote a scene where, much earlier in his life, in his 30s, he's now kind of sort of druggy guy running a record shop in Camden Town on the canal, and a little girl comes in to buy a record for her mum. She wants Chuck Berry. She says that her mum only listens to classical music, and then she says, my mum always says Chuck Berry's bouncy and merry. And at that point he knows he's looking at the daughter that he should have had, but he says nothing, and he just hands her the record. But it sends him into a kind of contemplative mode about it. So opportunities came that were not there, and not appropriate maybe for a novel. Although, had I thought of that record scene, I would have put it in there.
Yeah.
Put it in there.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I've read the book, I love it, but it's very interesting hearing like scenes that actually you would have liked to put in had you thought of it. Do you think that the kind of collaborative element of filmmaking, and the way that in a film it's a lot of people that almost have an interpretation that all go towards to creating this final thing, do you think having those exterior influences and those other views on it affected the way that you were able to grow it even further? Oh, absolutely.
I mean, one of the great things of film sets, and I'm sure you all find the same, the extent of the mutual trust that's required, how everybody depends on everyone else, and also the concentration of skill. I mean, if you have 30 or 40 people on a film set, from carpenters, fitters, right through sparks, focus pullers, best boys, whatever, if it's a good set, you're always with incredibly good people who know their business really well. Then at the sort of top end, the input of actors is fantastic. For a screenplay writer, rehearsal is crucial, I think. Taking things out, one tends to overwrite. Tend to be a little worried that people have not fully understood the emotional drift. Then you find once people are speaking and once actors are bringing it to life, you need far less. So there's always that paring back process. The input of a cinematographer also is vital. But then also, I'm very lucky in these two recent movies to be working with theatre directors, basically. Richard Eyre, Dominic Cook, both really are in their hearts theatre men, and they feel it's their business to bring a text to life, not to simply take a text and shred it or mould it to the shape of their own imagination necessarily, but to they see it as sort of a duty, as it were, to understand it and then bring it to the best realization they can, as they would in the British tradition of theatre. I mean, continental concept theatre is very different, I know, where they tear up the play and start all over again. But our rather more pragmatic direction is marvellous for a writer. It becomes writer-centred. So I was lucky to have both Richard on the Children Act and Dominic with on Chesil Beach, having a collaboration in which we just say, how do we realise this? What's the best way to make this? And that would be my advice to all screenplay writers. Make sure your director has his feet firmly in the theatre.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way to kind of almost close it, because I was going to ask, in terms of being a screenwriter and working with people, especially if you haven't necessarily come from a film background.
Yes.
What do you find yourself doing on set, and what do you wish you could do on set, and you could encourage filmmakers that don't do screenwriting to think about when they work with a screenwriter?
Once a movie's up and running, there's very little for a writer to do, and actually being on set, it's just heartbreaking, really, and very boring. And there's only so many bacon sandwiches you can eat. Setups take a long time. Only if something is going wrong does the joy strike you, because you can solve it. I made a movie with John Schlesinger, The Innocent, and lots of things went wrong, and I spent 7 or 8 weeks on set trying to make things right. All sorts of things went wrong with the set, all kinds of interpersonal things. Scenes had to be very quickly rewritten, in one corner of the set while everybody waited and went back to their trailers. Then you really do feel the adrenaline rush. But if things are going well, everything should be set from the screenplay point of view on day one, and there should be nothing to do but pay a courtesy visit.
Brilliant. That's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And good luck for On Chesil Beach.
Well, good luck in your careers,
Thank
all
you.
of
And
you.
for the Children Act, which I know you're currently working on.
No, it's all done.
Is it all done?
Yeah.
Well, good luck when it comes
yes,
out.
out in August. Yeah.
Ah,
They
brilliant.
started shooting the same day.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and finished the same day.
Oh.
So each night I had 3 hours of rushes to watch. It was great. Very lucky.